welcome everyone. Participants, you will be automatically muted and your cameras will be off throughout the panel. If you need any technical assistance, please use the chat function. And following the panel, we will be having a question and answer session that will be conducted via the chat as well. My name is Liz Fricaro, and I am the project director of the Antiquities Coalition's Financial Crimes Task Force. The Antiquities Coalition is a nonprofit organization and think tank that unites a diverse group of experts in the fight against the illicit trade in ancient art, which is funding crime, armed conflict, and violent extremism around the world. The Antiquities Coalition unites business leaders, former government officials, lawyers, security experts, and other professionals. And in this work, they join forces with a wide range of partners, including the art world, to strengthen legal markets and trade practices. We are so fortunate today to have a distinguished expert panel to share their insight on this critical topic. Tess Davis is a lawyer and archaeologist by training and is executive director of the Antiquities Coalition. She oversees the organization's work to fight cultural racketeering and also manages the day-to-day operations of the Institute's staff in Washington, D.C., as well as programs overseas. Mike Lockney is the former director of special operations at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, OIG Investigations, and has served in counterterrorism as a counterterrorism instructor for the Department of Defense. He designs and delivers training programs in support of the development of skills in the investigation of financial crimes, counterterrorism, fraud, and employee integrity. Tess Davis, if you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself.
Yes. Wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Again, my name is Tess Davis. I'm executive director of the Antiquities Coalition as well as an attorney. And I just wanted to start by telling you a little bit about our Financial Crimes Task Force, which will be coming up throughout the session today, and which the other speakers, we were so lucky to have them involved with this effort. So we convened the Financial Crimes Task Force to support both the public and the private sector in combating financial crimes via art and antiquities, be that trafficking, money laundering, terrorist financing, fraud, forgery, the list goes on and on. This was a multi-stakeholder initiative, the first of its kind of the United States, and it united allies from the financial sector, from the art world, and the legal communities, as well as former law enforcement and government officials. And over the course of around a year and a half, this diverse group of experts worked together to develop recommendations for protecting the American art market from criminal misuse. And their resulting report, Reframing U.S. Policy on the Art Market, was published in September of last year through an interactive resource. And what this report did, it calls for new policies, new practices, new priorities for the United States to implement on its own, and also in conjunction with the private sector and international community. So I encourage everyone here to visit the website, explore the interactive resources, and read the report in full. However, I know we have a discussion to get to, and again, several elements of this will be coming up. So look forward to answering your questions soon in the discussion.
And Mike Lockney, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, Liz, thank you. Sounds okay, everything you can hear okay? All right, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Lockney. I own a small business known as Lockney & Associates, where we largely focus, as Liz indicated, in training and working with law enforcement, the intelligence community, and we have branched out to really where there's a significant requirement, I think, for this kind of work, which is into the private and public sectors. And that's something that we have been doing for several years. And it's the reason that it's so important is so many times everyone thinks that this is a law enforcement function when it's actually not. When you think about where the actual activity in financial crime occurs, it occurs in the business section. It occurs in the financial sectors. That's where the information is found. That's where the activity is occurring. And where do we need to have better due diligence and better awareness than in those sectors? Law enforcement as a structure is largely a reactive element. They don't necessarily start cases, but when they receive information about something going on, that's when they will then have maybe start an investigation and then move forward against the issue at hand. And who identifies that? The business sector, the financial sector, all these other elements, places where the activity is occurring. And that's what drew me, quite frankly, to working with the Antiquities Coalition in this mission that they have, because it's so important. Because the elements to understand how financial crime works and how it actually functions is not in the art area. It's pretty wide open. So to help gain more awareness in the community, to watch for the illicit activity, to build the tools and that would identify and detect, to get a better understanding of how illicit networks, both criminal and terror, use these sectors in order to generate revenue and move value around the world. That is a significant concern that the art and antiquities community needs to deal with. And there have been some recent changes to go in the right direction. And we want to move forward and support that development because it's going to deal with the vulnerabilities that are in the sector now and make it a better place. So that's the kind of thing hopefully we'll be talking about today.
Thank you so much. I'd like to get started by talking about the art market as a whole. It's a rapidly growing global trade, and sales in the art market totaled $64.1 billion in 2019. Art and collectible wealth held by ultra high net worth individuals worldwide is predicted to grow from 1.62 trillion in 2016 to an estimated 2.7 trillion in 2026. US art market within this system has been called the largest unregulated market in the world. What does this mean?
Tess, you want to go first on that, or you?
Sure, and this is something that we do note in our report that, Les, as you say, the art market is frequently referred to as the largest unregulated market in the world. And what we mean and what others have meant by that. And we actively did try in compiling this report to find another industry of comparable scale and reach that was likewise not subject to regulation, and could not find anything close. And this is because so-called at-risk industries around the world, and this is a matter of US law, the law in most jurisdictions now, have been over the years, the law has sought to protect them from misuse by financial criminals. And let me say too, this is not a reflection or an accusation that people in the art market are criminals, but rather that criminals look to misuse the art market. And so regulating this industry is no different than policemen in the community saying you need to put up security lights and lock your doors at night. You're not accusing the homeowners there of being criminals, and we're certainly not doing the same thing with the art market. But what you see is that in recent decades, and particularly since 9/11, that the law has sought to cut off the world economy to criminal misuse. And where it stands today in the United States, and specifically, is that financial institutions, so what we would think of as financial institutions, banks, insurance agencies, group like that, are subject to anti-money laundering laws and protections. But it's not just financial industries. It's also been other industries that are considered at particular risk of being misused. So this is sellers of precious metals, sellers of stones, of jewels, sellers of automobiles, planes, boats, but also casinos, real estate professionals, travel agencies, and pawn shops. All of these groups have been under the AML infrastructure in the United States and in most of the world, and in many cases for some time now. But art, despite the fact that it's unique properties, despite the fact that it's high dollar value, despite the fact of all these different things that make it very susceptible to financial crimes, it's been exempt. This is starting to change now, as we'll be discussing, but it's a glaring gap in the legal framework, both in the United States and around the world. Mike, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to add on quickly. I think what you've described, and you're absolutely spot on in the description. All these things that Tess identified all fit within the structure of what we would call value transfer systems. It's easy to recognize, for example, that money moves through banks or money moves through real estate and that kind of thing, because we're used to that. What may not be so obvious in the eye of anyone outside of this sector is how much money and value moves through art and antiquities. And that ability to move value creates the vulnerability for its misuse. And again, as Tess said, it doesn't mean that the people in the sector are doing something wrong, but without effective oversight or regulatory controls or awareness, it creates the vulnerabilities that allow them to be misused and to be abused. And it's that area of vulnerability that allows significant amount of money to move between individuals or between entities, sometimes for legitimate purposes, but what's the protections against illegitimate purposes? And this is the point of that's the point of the study that was done, saying that there needs to be better identification and better dealing with those, understanding how the market works, understanding what the risk and vulnerabilities are in that market, and then building a structure that helps identify and move forward to reduce the risk of misuse of the art sector.
To what degree then are other markets regulated, both in the United States and internationally, and how does that compare to the art market today?
I'll start on that very quickly. The other sectors, you typically have a lot more regulation because there's a lot more awareness to it. And frankly, they've been worked on for a longer period of time. Banks in the United States, it started all the way back to 1970 with the first enactment of the Bank Secrecy Act. And that, if you're familiar with that law or set of laws, it has been something it's a living document. It is constantly changing as we become more aware of how business sectors, financial sectors are being impacted, how the new tools and techniques that come into play, up to, well, just this year with the new enactment under the current legislation that's going to bring a whole, slate of changes in to try to improve money laundering sector. So I guess the point is that it can be, we're just now getting a feel or starting to get a feel for exactly what are the challenges here in this sector and how do we set this up? It's not just the art itself. It's the value of the art, the overvaluing, the undervaluing. It's the ability to obtain loans or other forms of revenue off of the art. It's kind of like I equate it back to the pawnbroker kind of stuff. Someone loans it for money. These are the kinds of things that just understanding the sector and then understanding the risks and then building the appropriate tools and monitoring mechanisms to reduce the risk. You're never going to eliminate it, but it'll reduce the risk of those things being done for illegal purposes.
And just to build on what Mike was saying, so one reason that the art market is particularly vulnerable to this is the fact that it hasn't been regulated yet. As you mentioned in your opening statement, law enforcement, by necessity really, is often reactive. From our conversations, we've worked closely with federal agents, closely with prosecutors, both state and federal, who are doing these types of cases. And they have frequently told us that they usually learn of these cases from these things called SARs, suspicious activity reports, that, for example, a bank or other financial institution under AML laws has to file when they see something suspicious. Art market actors, even if they're acting in a financial capacity, for example, Mike mentioned, loaning money against art, which is happening, they have not been required to file these reports. So it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. Law enforcement doesn't get the tips about what's suspicious, they then don't have anything to investigate unless they actively go searching for it. And so you don't see the number of cases that you might see in other areas. So one reason art is vulnerable to this is that it's been historically unregulated, but there's a number of other aspects of it that make it stand out, that make it higher risk. And one of these is, of course, as Mike mentioned, the value, that something relatively small can be worth millions, tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. There's not many commodities that reach that level of value. Also, it's generally, not always, but generally portable. So very different from something like real estate, because you can easily carry it across national borders. You can easily ship it, where we see, an increasing number of antiquities, illicit antiquities that are looted and trafficked going through sites like FedEx. It's technology has made these things easy. But on top of all of this, you also have the fact that the price can vary widely. So things like gold have a pretty standard price globally, but you can take a painting, an antiquity, give it to two equally qualified experts or appraisers, and they could come up with widely different values for it financially. Then you put that piece up for auction, and what someone is willing to pay for it will be widely different from that. And so that fact can be easily misused by criminals to undervalue something, to overvalue something, as the case may be. And finally, another aspect that contributes is that the art world has always had what they themselves perhaps would call a culture of discretion, what others might call a culture of secrecy, but it has not been unusual to not know the name of the owner of something that you're buying. Which, we would never buy a car from someone not knowing who that person or institution, not knowing who the seller was. But this happens through, for art all the time. In fact, I think sometimes, certainly at auction, you're more likely to not know the actual owner than you are to know who the owner is, which is not something that you see in a lot of other goods transfers. The comparison to a pawn shop is very apt, because when you look at the business models of a major auction house, they really operate much like a multi-billion-dollar pawn shop. But again, pawn shops, mom and pop businesses, and Milwaukee, or here where I live in New Orleans, they've been subject to these anti-money laundering laws. The major auction houses haven't. So this is something that we're hoping will change, again, both to protect the art market itself, but also to protect our cultural heritage.
And to what degree have efforts to regulate the art market been successful? We know that legislation has recently been passed in the United States. How does that compare to other major market countries?
Well, I'll start on that first, if that's okay. There's really, there has been a significant international movement to try to bring this under more visibility, I guess. And I want to be careful how I say that, because we're not, there's not an effort to say, okay, now we have to rein in the whole art market, but it's more just understanding that it has significant risk factors that are, that have been addressed in other sectors where value transfer occurs, and it just hasn't been significantly shaped in this market. So it's bringing that in. The best example I can give you is, for a couple of years ago, the European Union, they have a series of rules within their directives called the anti-money laundering directives. And the sixth one they came out, which is specific to dealing with anti-money laundering. The history of them brings in requirements relative to reporting, the filing of suspicious transaction reports, all the things Liz was kind of talking about. The sixth money laundering directive added art and antiquities, or added art dealers into that as a structure. So now that is still being built. This stuff doesn't all of a sudden go poof, here's the new law, everybody follow it. There has to be a structure to really put this into play, but it is in the directive, so things are going to happen. And this will require the reporting of activity, or require suspicious activity reporting, but it also will require a certain amount of due diligence and disclosure as to who's active in the market and vetting those people to make sure that it doesn't appear it's happening for illicit means. That actually, there's a lot of information that will be in public registers relative to this. So people at large will be able to see, who's engaged and what's going on, and deal with that point that Tess brought up about anonymity, which is a significant tool or capability within the art sector. Tess mentioned, and the reason for the report, that I was honored to be a part of the team to pull that together under the Antiquities Coalition, help bring in new legislation for antiquities dealers in the United States, where that's going to come into play, and they're going to have a requirement relative to meeting the same requirements as other like industries that are present in the US. So you can see that this is going to bring in the requirements for compliance. It's going to bring in the ability to have more visibility about what's going on. And hopefully it works two ways. One is more information will come into the area of the government, law enforcement, for example, so that if illicit activity is identified, an investigation can take place. But secondly, it's going to ensure that tools and capabilities are inserted into the sector to be more alert to what's going on in the sector and be more mindful for the way business is being conducted. Because nobody wants to deal with illicit activity in any business. And this is simply making sure everyone's aware that this is the kind of thing that's going on, and here's what to watch for.
Yeah, and just to build on that, as Mike mentioned and Liz mentioned, other jurisdictions have begun to tackle this. Of course, this is coming relatively late in the scheme of things. We mentioned that the Bank Secrecy Act was back to 1970. Coincidentally, that's the same year as the main international treaty to combat the illicit trade in art and antiquities. So it's taken, half a century to get to this point where we're starting to see it, but we are starting to see it, particularly in Europe. Mike mentioned the EU directive, but also the United Kingdom and Switzerland have also similar laws on the books, meaning that effectively Europe is increasingly covered. Now, what does this mean for the United States? For one, the art market is very global. So you have a lot of American dealers, galleries, auction houses, even museums that are participating in the global marketplace. And if they're having to do that in Europe, which beyond the United States makes up most of the art market, they're going to have to be compiling with these laws anyway. Two, it means that if the United States doesn't take comparable action, we're going to risk our market becoming more of a safe haven for the criminals who are seeking to jurisdiction shop and looking for favorable places to commit their crimes. And so it does both, on the one hand, the laws we're seeing in Europe will, perhaps make it easier on the art market if we start to see a similar standard across the world. But two, it puts us at great risk if Congress, if the United States fails to meet the level of these laws that we are seeing in Europe.
It's very helpful to go over the comparable legislation internationally. Are there particular challenges to implementing this legislation within the art market that maybe are unique to the art market and we have not seen in comparable markets that have come under AML regulation recently?
Mike, would you like to start with that?
Oh, I can. I think my position may be a little bit different than yours, but I'll take a shot at it first. The difference in the market is it's been so open for so long, and the business structures are designed in such a way that, frankly, one of the major attributes to it is the anonymity factor. It's always been there. The regulations that are coming in are going to specifically put a target on that as an issue. The understanding of beneficial ownership, who's actually deriving the benefit from the transactions. If you're not the one directly in the transaction, who's behind the screen supporting that transaction moving forward. We've all seen or been participants in those auctions where you've got those guys on the phone and they're waving their hands when they're up to 25 cents for a product. That's about the range I can afford. But that's the point is there's an anonymity factor that this stuff is going to deal with. So I guess just to put it very quickly, there are current practices in the market that are different from other ones. that they're going to have to deal with. It's not like those practices have not been looked at other places. So it's not necessarily going to be brand new tools, but it's going to be definitely be a mind change, a mindset change as to how it as an industry works. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge that's going to be facing them.
No, and as Mike mentioned, there on the one hand, there's no need to reinvent the wheel here. This is something that, frankly, most other industries have gone through at some point and have survived. The example we cite in the report that we believe is the closest parallel is, for example, the jewelers industry. And like art, this is another market, another sector where you see, you know, a wide range of businesses, everything from mom and pop, you know, stores that have been in the same family for generations and might still be using, you know, paper-ridden inventories, to, you know, major global corporations and everything in between. And from our conversations with those who were involved in the process when they were put under the AML framework, there were similar fears, similar arguments that they should be spared this burden. And again, everyone came out the other side okay eventually. One thing I do think it's important to highlight is that there are major costs of inaction here. I mean, to do just one example, last year, the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations published the results of a 2-year investigation showing that a pair of Russian oligarchs had evaded US sanctions on Russia by laundering funds through the US art market, and not through back alley dealers either, but from, you know, through top galleries, the top auction houses, to the tune of at least $18 million, with tens of millions more tied to suspect shell companies. Now, again, this was the subject of a 2-year investigation by Congress. It made front page news, at least around the country, headlines around the world, and a pretty competitive news cycle at the time. And think of what these auction houses, how they had to respond to this. They had to hire criminal attorneys. The publicity alone, the bad publicity, was a huge cost. And so you see the cost of inaction can be quite high as well. And so that's something that we hope the industry keeps in mind, and that we also hope there is an opportunity here for the US government to work closely with the art market. And because, again, it's in the interest of the legitimate market, it's in the interest of the US government to work with them, with the financial sector as well, and sorting out the best way to implement the new regulations that are coming, to do so in a way that is fair to business, that protects business, but also protects our markets from criminal misuse. And so that's something that we hope we will see. There certainly is an opportunity here.
You know, before you jump in, let me do a quick follow-up on that, because I think it's a very important example that Tess brought forward here. Recognize that the individuals she's discussing, they were designated. Had they walked in the door themselves, never would have happened. But they set up a series of shells and fronts and networks that hid and masked their identity and their sourcing. And that was the structure that was brought against the industry to allow them to do the business they're going to do. These illicit networks sometimes have multiple layers of protections to hide the actual beneficial owners or the end result of the product. And that's important to know, because the structure, what we're describing here for the sector, is not that they know they're dealing with illicit activity. It's to be aware of those signs that illicit activity is going on. Because I will tell you, the negative side of these rules, as they come out, is going to be the government coming forward saying, it's not that you didn't know, it's that you should have known. And that's important to recognize, because it means you have to have these structures in place to be alert to this activity. And if you don't have it, then the governments are going to come back and say, why not? And what could you have done better? And gee, I'm sorry you were victimized, but shame on you. And then you've got the lawsuits and the other issues that Tess brings up.
And even to go beyond that, I mean, for sanctions, even if you didn't know, even if you had no inkling, you could still be, I mean, it doesn't happen often, but you could still be held to criminal liability. Indeed, and I want to say it was October of last year. So following this congressional report, OFAC published a warning to the art market saying, again, even if you don't know that you're evading sanctions, if your businesses are helping criminals to evade sanctions, you can be held liable.
Mhm.
We are told these warnings are unusual, and they do them when there is a case they are trying to preempt. So there's usually a concrete reason, for these warnings. So that's a pretty stark message from the U.S. government there. And again, an ounce it's a cliche, but cliches are usually cliches because there's some truth to them. That the ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure, and that certainly I think is something we see here.
In the example that you raised here with the Russians who were evading sanctions, that's just two individuals. And some commentators claim that you really shouldn't judge an entire industry based on the actions of just a few bad actors. And what is your response to that argument?
Well, to jump in here, again, I think, and I would keep coming back to this point, but I think it's important to stress that the art market was as much a victim of the Rodenbergs as the U.S. government was. Again, this was, we can only imagine the conversations that went on behind closed doors, Sotheby's and Christie's, when you have U.S. investigators and OFAC showing up on your doorstep, and you get your Wall Street Journal and you're on the front page of it for helping, these dear friends of Putin evade U.S. sanctions. The Antiquities Coalition, and this is included in our report, has done a lot of research on the intersection between the art market and financial crimes. And looking at the cases that do exist that we do know about, it makes clear it's a global problem. And again, the criminals range from these small-time crooks to infamous kleptocrats, names of which you would all recognize. But in the cases that have come across our desk, although do let me stress there is an exception in the Rodenberg case, in that they were able to evade the sanctions because they were working with this art dealer who was well known globally. But the criminals are rarely art market professionals themselves. They're rarely dedicated collectors. Again, they're usually these bad actors who have seen and then exploited these real and glaring weaknesses in the art markets. So I doubt that the Rodenbergs, to go back to this case, I doubt they were acting out of a love of art here. I think it's much more likely that they saw the art market as an opportunity to acquire assets in the United States and to pass millions of dollars, through these businesses and their shell companies in the United States. So it's not, again, a matter of judging the art market from the actions of a few individuals, but of protecting an entire industry from the actions of criminals who seek to abuse it. And again, just to go back to the metaphor, if you have a neighborhood policeman coming to your house saying, ma'am, you should put up security cameras, you need to lock your doors at night, why don't you get a fence? That's not a reflection on me as a homeowner. It's protect yourself. And so obviously none of us are as good as protecting ourselves as we should be. And this goes for individuals, for institutions, and whole industries. Sometimes we need some help from the US government and regulations, and that's where this comes in.
Just as a very quick follow-up, I know we're running shorter on time, but the thing has to be recognized, I do training in this area. I've been doing it for a very long time. And usually when you see these kinds of stories come forward, it's because they're great case examples. What we're discussing here, what we're describing here are processes. And many times an individual event will identify the processes that might be used in abusing a sector. So that the processes that were identified, as Tess said, the use of the gatekeeper, the use of the art broker, who then helped mask and protect who they were in the art they were buying. The fact that they identified the risk in the sector and how they were going to exploit it. These are not art sector focused, they're process focused. and the process is being applied to the art sector. So to simply say there's one example is simply saying it's one that we can discuss and you'll understand the elements to it. But if you start doing research and pull out case studies, there are multiple cases, large and small, that exactly the same thing is going on. And that's when you get to the point with, okay, do we need a regulatory response? And that's when it starts to go forward.
In our last minutes here for discussion, I'd like to pivot to speaking about the COVID-19 pandemic. It obviously is a major global health problem, but it's also caused problems for industries and the economy. And if you could each speak to the challenges it has presented and how it has changed the landscape, both for AML and for the art market.
I'll go first, Liz, Tess, if that works for you guys. Basically, this is something I've been doing, having this kind of talk on a number of different sectors for quite a while now. The thing that COVID has done, particularly from my perspective, from dealing from an intelligence or law enforcement perspective, is it has weakened the ability to respond. One of the things, for example, is you've worked remotely, so you may not have access to all the material you might otherwise need to put forward to identify what's going on and initiate an investigation. In many industries where a documentation element is required for due diligence or know your customer constructs, there's been a significant relaxation in documentation where expired documents, because you couldn't get there to renew them in time, like a driver's license, has been accepted as valid ID. You've had activities such as a change in activities unusual to the customer or the individual because of the COVID issue, significant cash withdrawals or other monetary decisions that are not unique, not identifiable to that customer, all of a sudden taking place. There's a significant list of these kinds of things. The bottom line is COVID changed activity. Law enforcement, or this kind of thing we're talking about, is a lot of it is based on pattern and understanding how customers operate within a sector. The COVID issues have changed those patterns, and it's made it more difficult to identify the suspicious activity that might otherwise result in an investigative response.
Yeah, and just to build on that, you know, a lot of this is happening in real time, so we probably won't know the full impact of COVID for ages. But the initial things that we were seeing, and this was frankly in the earliest days, actually, even when lockdowns were being discussed before they were being implemented, worked closely with a number of site security experts and museum security experts, and they were all going, wow, this is going to be really dangerous for heritage collections and sites, because whether you're talking about looting in Cambodia, whether you're talking about the heist of the Gardner paintings in Boston, criminals, you know, use crisis, or in the Boston case, the St. Patrick's Parade, as a distraction to do things. And so you're looking at museums on skeleton staffs, you're looking at archaeological sites on skeleton staffs. And that from the beginning, people were warning that, oh, you know, looting and theft is going to go up. But we've started to see that from reports, again, early on. So, I mean, just under a year ago, of increased looting at sites, of theft from museum collections. On the flip side of that, so that's the supply end for the illicit trade. On the market side, you know, interesting things were happening as well. I don't think sales went down as much as people were expecting. In-person sales did, obviously, but you also counter that online sales have boomed. And of particular interest for financial crimes, this thing called art lending or financing skyrocketed. Again, we're still waiting on exact statistics, but the quotes that you see in the Wall Street Journal and places like that it doubled, quadrupled. And this is basically, as the name suggests, loaning money against art. So we can see how in a recession, a depression, how if you had a substantial collection of any type of art, how you might need some hard cash and might be willing to take out a loan for that. As this come up, the auction houses and a number of boutique firms are acting as lenders in that cases. So they're acting as banks effectively, but they haven't been subject to the same protections of banks. And so there's a lot of interesting things. It could be its own panel to discuss this, but Pretty much every expert we've talked to have said that, criminals are quicker to adapt than law enforcement. They can adapt immediately. And that, from the illicit trade, from theft, from money laundering, everyone was expecting it to go up across the board. And also that the institutions in the art market that have been particularly hit hard, where it's a museum, not getting visitors fees, where it's a gallery not having in-person sales, they have less funding, less mental bandwidth to be on the lookout and to guard themselves from this. So a concerning time, the full extent of which will probably be some time before we know.
Thanks very much. In our last 5 minutes here, we'll take questions from our audience. We've already had a few submitted, so starting from in the order that we have received them. The first question is, how important is the role of free ports and other high secrecy storage facilities in enabling criminality in these markets?
I have an anecdote to share about this of something that I'm embarrassed I never considered, and it's why it's so important to have interdisciplinary conversations. Let's see, probably about 2 years ago now, I was attending the annual conference of ACAMS, which is the largest, to my knowledge, anti-money laundering convention in the world. And there was a panel on this subject there. Again, the audience, we're talking hundreds of people, but mostly banks, financial industry, security experts, compliance experts, et cetera, not people in the arts. Because I don't think at the arts, I don't think we would have thought of this. And our colleague John Byrne asked the audience when the subject of free ports came up, what's the usual tariff? What's the usual tax, import-export tax on art? And you have several people pop up and go, well, usually there isn't one. I mean, again, that's a general statement. Sometimes there is, but often there's no tax coming in or out on art. And so he said this simple question I've thought about ever since then. So why would you need to put art in a free port? Which again, I thought was very interesting because of course the whole raison d'etre of free ports is to avoid taxes. So if you're not avoiding taxes, what are you avoiding? So not to malign every free port out there, there are of course legitimate reasons to put art in them, but the evasion of taxes is not necessarily one of them. So Mike, anything to add to that?
Yeah, very much so. And I'll keep it very short, but exactly for the reason that you brought up, there's many legitimate reasons for free trade zones or free ports to exist, of course. I mean, they support and develop commerce locally and internationally. I mean, they're critical to the trade industry, but it's also one of the most significant violations because it are areas of violation, because it is such a important tool in the trade sector that a lot of enforcement rules are just not applied within them. So it's much easier from an illicit perspective to move things through the trade zones, the trade sectors, the free zones, because by design, they don't have the same visibility as other means of transport are. So from an illicit perspective, free trade zones, not just art, but pretty much of any kind of commodity that we're describing in a trade-based money laundering scenario, free trade zones are the sweet spot for a lot of this illicit activity to move through. So again, if you know the networks and you know how to make it work, by all means, one of the colleagues that I know of, a gentleman named John Cassara, has written a number of great books on this topic, and I'd recommend you look up some of his work.
Thank you. Do you have any insights about why the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, addressed trade in antiquities but did not extend to art more generally? Is this simply because there are arguably tighter ties between the antiquities trade and terrorist financing, or is there more to it?
Tess, how about you on that one?
Well, are you still able to hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. We had first assumed that it was for the reason and the question, or that it was a result of lobbying from the art market. However, from our conversations, it looks like it was actually a much simpler explanation, and that the that Congress was not yet willing to tackle the problem of what is art. And they thought it was easier to start with antiquities before getting to that broader question. I wouldn't say I would agree with that approach. Antiquities can be equally challenging to define, but it does look like that it was a process reason as opposed to a substantive one, again, from the conversations we've had.
Interesting. I would just add that it's not in there now, it's going to come, because you're seeing it from an international perspective. And just because of the international nature of art, the art market, if it's going on in Europe, it's going to be here in the US. So just wait, it's coming.
Well, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have come up against the end of our session here and still have some remaining questions. I do encourage you to reach out to us if you would like to speak about your questions with our speakers. And you can find contact information for us on the Antiquities Coalition website, as well as Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you again, everyone, for attending. This was a really wonderful session. And thank you to our speakers for giving us such a reasoned explanation of this very complicated problem.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Myself,
much.
and please reach out to us. Very much interested in talking to people who have an interest in this as a topic. You've got our email addresses. I'm very happy to. The question on the non-fundable tokens question we didn't get to, I'd love to talk to you more about that. So please feel free to email us on it.
All right, thanks, everyone.